And 50 hours of presentation, so if you want to stay another 3 weeks, we should get through them. You had a taste of it, the ones who did the critics questionnaire. I think I only got 3 who did them actually. Yeah, no, I know we did it. Only 3. And what? Who did the work from Tata? I don't think he's here. Oh, you did it, right? Yeah, you came very high. In fact, you got one of the highest scores I've ever seen.
So Tata, I just took as a Tata group, entire company, entire group.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of initiatives.
Yeah. You got 0.91.
9192.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the highest I've ever, in fact, the highest I've ever seen. So, says something about something.
They have an NGO called KPA.
Oh, okay.
We do support it, but we don't.
It's totally funded by you.
It will be part funded.
In fact, all the trustees are on board of that.
Now, what I was going to do leading into that questionnaire was to show you how it linked to the definition and the framework that I'm using. The good news is if you want to research that, it's all on my website, MHC-International.com, on measurement aspects, and also on the online course if you want to do that. It goes into that in some detail. It's about 20 hours of reading, depending how quickly you want to do it. I could go through that measurement aspect very quickly, but it's quite important to measure what you're doing, as you got from the interchange we had this morning a little bit, that this group, ESOR, was actually measuring what it was doing. And it's kind of obvious. And as I mentioned in my remark, around the world I've done a lot of evaluations for UN, World Bank and so on, which is why I was in India before actually. I evaluated the ILO's employment intensive program when I came to India to see what they were doing here. But what was interesting is how few people really keep indicators of what they're doing, even simple indicators, like in training projects. How many people have been trained? You would think at least put that down. And for I would say 99% of the projects I looked at around the world, you can't find out. So I mean, how do people know what they're doing and so on? So that was what I was going to talk a little bit about, measurement and impact analysis. The third thing was the reading I mentioned last night on social enterprise. I don't know if you looked at that website. It's very short actually. It was a set of questions that were posed to me, which I'd answered, but it gives you an idea of the structure as I saw it in social enterprise, and I defined social enterprise on that. And it links very much with Jar's work on his discussion yesterday, which is why I thought it was a nice thing to do. And I thought after reading it, probably raise other questions that we could discuss. But let me just make a list of things I was going to do, and then we can discuss what we want to do. Then 4, I have a CSR strategy. I thought perhaps we could start with that. I think there's some interest in that. And there are 2 aspects of the CSR strategy. One is I'm going to give you kind of general view of strategy, what it means and so on, and then I narrow it down to 15 points, which I've developed over the years based on a number of experiences. And then I was thinking quickly showing you a very specific example to, in fact, perhaps to the football associations of Europe, all 53 of them, and where I'm hoping, as we speak, they're implementing that. I doubt, but I'm hoping. So I think you prefer that I focus here to begin with, and then if there's any time left, we can go through any of those others or any other aspects you wanted. Somebody also mentioned to me, Puneet mentioned to me the question of auditing. That's also a growing field for certain CSR companies. Understand what is strategy, learn how to put a CSR strategy in place and investigate a case study. So, what is strategy? So this definition comes from one of the top theorists of business management in Europe, Professor Abi Gabadian, who actually hails from Iran. When I first started working on CSR, Abi was the dean at Middlesex University, and he made the mistake of inviting me to be a professor there. And not realizing that he had a kind of, you understand Venn diagrams. So his Venn diagram of strategic management was here, and he thought CSR was kind of over there somewhere. Today, he now makes presentations of CSR and strategy, and the Venn diagrams would coincide, which I think is pretty interesting. I actually still think that his vision of strategic management is actually less than CSR, because I think CSR is actually a new business strategy. So anyway, you can see what he says there, rational decision making and blah, blah, blah. Why do organizations need strategy? Now this is based on Abi's work, with hundreds of companies, or big companies right across the world. And he's pretty convinced, and if you go to those business schools, this is what they teach. What is strategy? What do you mean by a sense of direction? What do you mean by competitive advantage? And so on. We see at the bottom now to satisfy stakeholders, so that means Abi has moved a little bit into my direction. What I'm going to do very quickly is to say, well, then if you translate that into a 15-point strategy, and this is what I've come up with. Number one, what are the principles? So what are your business goals? And decide upon the purpose of the social responsibility program. And second, define your value statement and the mission of the company. Now, all this sounds rather boring stuff, but the value statement of most companies are the most expensive words in the country's history. The 10 or 20 words they put into it, they spend months poring over every word. But if you think about it, it can give a focus to a company. So this is pretty key. What we've been trying to do with value statement is to add on some CSR components. Once you manage to get that far, 3, what are your competitors doing on CSR benchmark? Now all this is based in reality. Is that when I presented this to the board of directors of Addicts Petroleum in Geneva a few years ago, when you're presenting things, as you know, it's not just a question of getting up on your feet. It's got to be put into context. Well, the context turned out to be really lousy. I kind of expected it. What happened was that Addicts Petroleum never adopted our strategy, which was interesting. And in fact, about 3 months after, they got taken over by Sinotec, a Chinese oil company. But they did happily develop a foundation before they got taken over, which continues today. And it's actually called still the Addicts Foundation. And it was capitalized, I think, along what we suggested, about $10 million. And on the interest, they continue on sustainable type of projects today. So benchmarking is quite important. And then 4th, a budget. Identify your key stakeholders. Thank you very much. You saw from this morning's presentation, the oil company had come up with an idea of stakeholders. But anyway, you get an idea that they took that quite seriously. So what I liked about the presentation this morning, it reinforced a lot of things that I've been saying yesterday. Even their definition wasn't too far away. So, and then research. This is close to the question of auditing. What are the latest business standards? What are our competitors doing? And these are some of the main ones here that I've listed. You found out in the questionnaire yesterday you came across SA 8000. I had slipped it in the morning yesterday, but I kind of mumbled it because I can't get you guys all getting 100% of my questionnaires. But SA 8000 is actually about 13 points about labour, and it's run out of New York by a lady called Alice Teppermalin, who used to be an investment broker on Wall Street. And she got so fed up with the Vietnam War, it was the time of the Vietnam War, and all these companies investing in defense industries because it was a thing to do to make money. But she set up SAI, social accountability, and well, I'm going to look at accountability of these companies. And she focused on the labor issues.
Is there a certification standard?
Pardon?
Is that a certification standard?
It is, a certificate, yeah. And what they do is they train people right across the world.
For labor.
Just on labor. And they train people right across the world. You can become an SA 8000 auditor and take their course. And I'm sure it's operational in India. So if you look on their website, you'll find it. There's a competing labour standard called FLA, Fair Labour Association, which is actually done by a former ILO civil servant. So they compete, but I have another slide, but I won't give it to you now, where I compare both of them, and they're pretty similar, although one is slightly different to the other. And then that thing with the fire extinguisher game comes up. I won't repeat that story, but what happened, Alice was very active, especially in Bangladesh, and just about all the fires and problems in Bangladesh and textile factories, many of the big ones, had actually been certified by SA 8000. So you see, certification does not necessarily mean that you're going to get away with all sorts of things. See, the problem with certification and auditing, and you asked about this, the problem is that the auditors have pretty limited time. And any of you who have experienced auditors doing financial reports or whatever, they come in very, very quickly, and they take a lot of things on trust. So it's very expensive, actually, if you've got 50 textile factories in Bangladesh and some based on islands in the Maldives, which I've come across, then you can't, the auditors won't get there. So they kind of, in their certification, say what we've seen looks as though they satisfy the tenets of our audit, and so they give a bit of a cop-out. So they never could never give you 100% clearance. So you might in turn ask, what's the point of audits? And a lot of people have asked that over time. And also the big consulting firms like Price Waterhouse and Arthur Andersen no more after the fiasco with Enron, which collapsed because it certified Enron, and Enron collapsed shortly before Andersen Consulting. Is that after Enron and other auditing failures, they've tried to separate the auditing function from the consulting function. You might have heard about that. The consulting function is actually the most profitable part these days of these big firms, and they prefer not to do auditing, except through auditing they get their clients. On the other hand, how can you audit something that you're advising? So they tried to separate that, but they've not done that very well. I've gone on a little bit too long about that, probably because I know more about it. AA 1000 was called Accountability 1000. It was one of the first standards. In the early 90s they were set up. And they have different stages of going through. I don't know if they really call it CSR. They never really got into that. The head of that was a guy called Simon Zadek, who I've mentioned many times, and he's an old sparring partner of mine. And so he's kind of gone into sustainability and used AA 1000. AA 1000 slightly collapsed for a bit and then come back again. GRI is Global Reporting Initiative. Now people are saying, we've got a Global Reporting Initiative certification. Well, they've got thousands of indicators. So So how can you possibly really be certified for them? So it's actually a little bit smoke and mirrors when you see this. What it means that they've picked some indicators in the huge space of GRI, and they say, you know, we've audited those in some way. Therefore, we're GRI certified. Since the chief trainer of GRI is actually joining my company in a month's time, we're gonna put that stuff to death. ILO conventions, as I mentioned yesterday, there are probably 500 or 600 of these conventions and recommendations. And I used to work for the ILO, and I got really upset. They spent all their time developing new conventions. There's not a single research paper in the ILO evaluating the impact of any of their conventions. Can you believe it? No more further comment. World Trade Organization and discussions. This is a very interesting discussion. I'm elaborating a bit here on these points because all these things will come up in this process. What's happened, there's a whole thing called the social clause in development, which the World Trade Organization has been thinking about trying to include in trade agreements, and these will be labor standards. But the problem is that countries in India has been quite vociferous in this, are saying to the World Trade Organization, you're being influenced by the rich countries in order to put up our labor standards so we become less competitive, and so you can drive us out of business. So this is a pretty hot potato for both the WTO and for the ILO, and to be honest, they haven't come to any agreement. This is still a state of flux. In the Planetary Bargain, the book that I wrote, my first book on CSR, I wrote and I thought that if everybody raised their standards together, including the US and Britain and the rest of it, then you would compete on quality and product and not on who's exploiting the labours the most. When I wrote that book, people said to me, Michael, companies are never ever going to work together because that's against laws of antitrust laws and competitive laws and the rest of it. But what's amazing, in fact, companies have actually come together to discuss these things under different mechanisms, some under NGOs like the BSCI, which actually was set up by Alice Teppermalin. So all these people are thick as thieves, you know, we all know each other. But it's kind of interesting what they're doing, getting companies together to actually discuss these things, and they're not getting sued by antitrust legislation because people realize that this is necessary, but they have to tread pretty carefully. But WTO and the ILO is still a bit arm's length away from this. The code principles actually developed into the Ceres principles, and so they're the same. And in fact, the people who worked on Ceres, Alan White and so on, worked on GRI. They actually started GRI. So I told you they're all thick as thieves, these people. But they mentioned